We're going to continue our study that we began this morning, Does God Care How We Dress? A study of modest clothing. I want to remind you of what our approach has been this day. We have been looking at, or we began with looking at, three issues surrounding modesty. I believe that there are three modesty issues in reference to the subject of modesty. And then we're going to look this evening. We've looked at two of those this morning, and we're going to look at one this evening, the last one. And then we're going to look at who should teach modesty. And then our third point that we will discuss is, does modesty apply to men? Remember that we talked this morning about two of the issues found in the matter of modesty. We talked about the nakedness issue. And we saw that in that issue that one can be partially clothed, and yet the Bible still recognizes, even society even recognizes the fact that that person technically is still naked. And so the question then that we looked at this morning was, well, okay, it's not difficult to figure out if someone has no clothes on, it's not difficult to figure out that they're naked. But what needs to be covered? How much is not enough? What are the parts that need to be covered? What is the partialness of that idea of nakedness? And so then we looked at some scriptures. We looked and saw some divinely designed clothing in Genesis chapter 3. We saw how that particular word, the covering, the clothing, how that was defined both in the Hebrew and in the Greek. And we looked at various references that gave a definition of that. We then talked about this morning the lust issue. We said the fact that there are times in which one may have the parts covered, but they may be covered in such a way that causes a lust issue. And so that's an issue completely different. And that some individuals may say, well, I'm covered, I'm not naked. No, but you have dressed yourself in such a way, either that by the tightness of the clothing, the thinness of the clothing, or something along those lines, it's creating, or there's the possibility of it creating, lust. And so we looked on some scriptures as to how that needs to be addressed. But this evening we want to look at the heart issue. Modesty is, in essence, a heart issue. And we mentioned this morning that, in essence, if we get this issue right, the nakedness issue and the lust issue take care of themselves. Isn't that the case with all of God's commandments? Isn't that always the case with the way that God wants us to live? Too many times we're addressing the action and addressing the action and addressing the action, and we keep having to address the action. Why? Because we've not found the problem is that it's the heart. And if we can address the heart, lo and behold, the actions take care of themselves. Jeff Pollard, in his book, Christian Modesty and the Public Undressing of America, made this very comment. He said, modesty is not first an issue of clothing. It is primarily an issue of the heart. And if the heart is right with God, it will govern itself in purity, coupled with humility, and will express itself modestly. It can't help but happen that way. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 4, the Apostle Peter, I think, addresses this heart issue. He says, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. I want you to notice the context of this passage in these two verses. When you look in verse 1 of chapter 3, the Apostle Peter tells us that in the same way, you wives. We ought to stop right there. Because before we go any further, we need to figure out Well, something has already been discussed. Ways have already been discussed. And wherever we're going now in chapter 3 is a continuation of what began in chapter 2 and is just another aspect of whatever has been being discussed. When you go back into chapter 2, you'll find that what is under consideration is the matter of submission. Verse 13 of chapter 2, submit yourself for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Submit to the governing authorities. Drop down to verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters. In the role of the master and the slave relationship, the slaves need to be submissive to the master. Even when they are difficult to be submissive to. Even when they are difficult to submit to. Because even our Lord submitted to individuals who made it difficult upon Him, who reviled Him, who reproached Him, and yet He submitted to them and did not revile in return. And so we're to follow in His steps. And now we come to chapter 3. In the same way, what? Well, we're talking about submission. In the same way, wives must what? Must be submissive in some way. In fact, we don't have to go very far because we see in the same way, you wives, be submissive. Be submissive to your own husbands. So that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. What is it that they're to observe? Well, a woman is to recognize that their adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and a quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. The overarching theme of this context is the matter of submission. How is a woman and what is a woman's attitude, godly wife, to be toward her husband, whether he is godly or not? And the attitude is still to be one of submission. But I want you to notice that in this passage, in the process of stating that a woman needs to be submissive and that her behavior needs to be chaste and respectful, that Peter says this kind of heart, this kind of an inner attitude needs to adorn themselves in a certain way. And one of the ways that it will not adorn themselves will be with merely concerning oneself with the braiding of the hair and the wearing of gold and the putting on of dresses. Now, does that mean that it's wrong to braid your hair? Does that mean that it's wrong to wear gold jewelry? Does that mean that it's wrong to put on a dress? What Peter is saying here is it's a matter of emphasis. What's going to be your emphasis? And so Peter says, braiding of the hair and wearing of gold jewelry and putting on of dresses, all of that is fine, but that can't just be merely what your emphasis is. That can't be your whole concern. A more important emphasis is the hidden person of the heart. And so I raise the question, what is her goal in this text? Is it to convert him or to keep him? I say that because I believe that there are times in which women who are in this situation, it seems to be they're more concerned with keeping their husband, and so as a result of that, you find them dressing in such a way that they believe will keep them. That's not the subject of this passage. The subject is a matter of submission. The subject is a matter of having respectful and chaste behavior. And the byproduct of doing that even without a word, just by your heart, just by your demeanor, just by your attitude, you might win your husband. You may convert him. As you have respectful and chaste behavior, and as your adornment is the hidden person of the heart and a gentle and a quiet spirit. But if your goal is to keep him, you're worried about security. You're worried about what will happen if you lose him. No, he's not a Christian, but he makes a good living. And so you're worried about losing him, then you'll find yourself emphasizing the wrong things. Braided hair, gold, and dresses. How would a woman dress if her attitude is submissive and her spirit is gentle and quiet? I mean, what does that look like? Do you go into the store and you say, well, this is the submissive line. This is the gentle and quiet spirit line of clothing. Well, we understand, no, it doesn't look that way. It's not labeled that way. So the question is then, how would a woman dress if her attitude is submissive and her spirit is gentle and quiet? Will she dress in such a way that draws attention to herself because of her adornment? One of the ways in which one tries to figure out what a principle looks like is to do the very opposite. Is to ask, well, what does it not look like? If it doesn't look like this, then it's very possible that I've achieved what it is I'm trying to get to. So, if we're trying to figure out how will a woman dress if her attitude is a submissive attitude, her spirit is a gentle and a quiet spirit, will she dress in such a way that draws attention to herself because of her adornment? That's what catches the eye of those who are around her. Her adornment may be proper when taking into account the nakedness issue, when taking into account the lust issue, but according to Peter, it still may be improper. She may be appropriately covered with clothing not designed for sexual attraction, but her choice of color or her accessories are selected to draw attention to her. Now, she may not have anything uncovered that doesn't need to be uncovered. And her clothing may not be sexually attractive in the least, but it may be loud. It may be bright. It may be intended to draw attention to her. Does that sound like the kind of woman that has a gentle and a quiet spirit, drawing attention to herself? This, brethren, is exactly the application that Peter makes in this passage. I found this on a blog. It was an individual that said, women may cover their cleavage and thighs just enough, yet make sure to put on an eye-popping necklace designed to draw compliments, lovelessly nitpick the immodest clothing choices of weaker Christians, or post a meticulously posed Instagram picture featuring her latest workout or Bible journaling session. Look at me, look at me, look at what I'm doing. Are we dressing immodestly in more subtle ways for accolades, approval, and attention? Does that look like a woman of a gentle and a quiet spirit? Don't stone me. I want you to think about something. I want you to consider your Facebook and your Instagram and your Snapchat pictures. How many selfies have you posed or posted to these forums? Now, it's possible that there are times in which you've done that, and there's nothing in the least that you're attempting to draw attention to yourself. I'll tell you what happened before we got here early. We're going to make sure we're going to be here tonight on time. So we got here early, and we talked about taking a selfie with us in front of the church building to show that we were here. And I said, I can't do that because I'm going to talk about selfies tonight. So that would be a little bit inconsistent. That's just to show that, there are times that we can take selfies. And there are times that that's not a big deal. But brethren, there are times that I know of some individuals that are taking these things, and it is a look at me, look at me, look at me. Is that the attitude of a woman that has a gentle and a quiet spirit? Is it wrong? Not necessarily. But is it a look at me attitude, a mentality? That's a problem. Where is our emphasis? Peter addresses that in 1 Peter chapter 3. But it's not just in 1 Peter chapter 3. It's also addressed in 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 and 10. Likewise, I want women to adorn themselves with proper clothing, modestly and discreetly, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly garments, but rather by means of good works as is proper for women making a claim to godliness. Then we notice that there were 3 qualifiers of modest clothing in this passage this morning. I want to look at those real quick again. Proper clothing. How is that defined? Not only the propriety of his dress and demeanor, but of his inner life, uttering and expressing itself outwardly. Where does one's inner life reside? In the heart. Look at the second qualifier. Modestly. An innate moral repugnance to a dishonorable act or fashion. Where does one's innate moral repugnance lie? In the heart. The third qualifier, discreetly. It is the habitual inner self-government. Where is that seated? In the heart. In all 3 of these qualifiers, even Paul addresses the fact, in the words that he chooses, that all of these things, we start modestly, we start modest apparel, we start the issue of discovering modesty in the heart first. All 3 of these qualifiers address that. But oftentimes I've heard someone say, but I want to look good for my man. I had this expressed with them. I want to look good for my husband. I want to look good for my man. Well, let's consider that for a moment. There's nothing necessarily wrong with wanting to look good, in their term, for your husband. But the emphasis should be on your attitude, not on your adornment or appearance. And I would question, especially this particular individual, I did question, are you really wanting to look good for him or for you or for others? Is this a display kind of thing? And women, you have to be honest about that. Because we looked at this morning that women's tendency is the desire to want to display, just as men's tendency is the desire to want to look. And so you have to recognize the fact that built in you is this desire to display. But there are times that it's got to be governed. It's got to be reined in. And so I've got to ask myself when I say, well, I want to look good for my husband, is that really the motivation? Is that really what you're doing? Are you really wanting to look good for him or for you or for others? How about this? How about emphasizing looking godly rather than looking good? Now, those two aren't poles apart and aren't opposite. But if the purpose of looking good is to be seen, is to display oneself, then they are opposite. Because if that's your attitude, brethren, that is not a godly attitude. How about emphasizing looking godly rather than looking good? Is this proper for women making a claim to godliness? Does this sound consistent with the passage in 1 Timothy chapter 2? Is this consistent with the action of a gentle and a quiet spirit? Again, how about emphasizing looking godly rather than looking good? Husbands, you need to think about this. Husbands want their wives to look good. In some cases, husbands want their wives to look good because it strokes their ego. Let me tell you a situation that I am unfortunately way too familiar with, of a man who desired this. Wanted his wife to look good. And she had an issue because she liked to look good. And so we've already got a bad situation setting up, don't we? He wants her to display herself, and she's glad to display herself. But he was an individual that would not give her the support that she needed. He just wanted her to display herself because it made him look good. And guess what happened? Because he wasn't as supportive as he needed to be, she found someone that was, and had an affair with this individual. And all the individuals that I'm referencing, brethren, are all Christians. All of them were. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you, and I'm not going to tell you that the whole problem started with modesty. But I will suggest to you that had the attitudes of the heart in reference to modesty been addressed, then this husband would not have been wanting his wife to display, to build his ego, and she would have been fighting the tendency to display so that others would look at her. And who knows what might have happened had they had a more godly approach to the matter of modesty and dealt with their hearts as they should. Husbands, what you need to remember is that which is precious in the sight of God is what Paul says. This is precious in the sight of God. That which is precious in the sight of God should also be what is precious in your sight. And if you find that you are valuing the wrong thing in your wives, if you are valuing the beauty and the adornment, and you're not valuing the attitude and the character and the disposition, then, brethren, you are valuing something that God does not value. You're valuing the wrong thing, and if you're on the opposite end of the value scale, you're on the wrong end. And you're not being a godly husband. So consider this. Remember that husbands have to be aware of the fact that this is not about your male ego. Jeff Pollard said, though it is true that one may dress modestly from a sinful and a prideful motive, one cannot knowingly dress lavishly and sensually from a good one. Thus, the purity and humility of a regenerate heart internally must ultimately express itself by modest clothing externally. That's just the way that it works. And so in the matter of modesty, there is the issue of nakedness, there is the issue of lust, and there is the most important issue that will deal with the other two and handle the other two, the heart issue. But who should teach this? Who should teach modesty? There was an interview that Gary Henry did, a gospel preacher, many years ago, that many individuals have used over the years. He happened to sit down, and he was traveling, and he sat down by a woman that was obviously a prostitute, and he just struck up a conversation with her and said, "You know a good bit about men." And she said, "It's my business to know." Gary said, "Well, why do religious women often not know as much about men?" And this was her comment, and it was rather reflective. "Because they've never been taught about men by anyone but their mothers, who often knew very little themselves. Women who know how a man thinks are those who have been taught by a man." Now let's think about this. Jeff Pollard said, "Above all, we men must learn how to govern our hearts and eyes, as well as to teach our wives and children the proper principles of modesty. Although women are vulnerable to wearing lavish and sensual apparel, their fathers and husbands are ultimately responsible for what the women in their homes wear." Men, we are responsible. We have got to teach. We have got to instruct our wives and our daughters what is modest. Fathers need to teach this. We saw this morning, did we not, that in the book on the business setting of men and women working together, and how that women dressed in such a way that was provocative or that was sensual, and yet that was not their intention at all. 1 in 4 women said that was their intention. 3/4 of them said that wasn't what we were trying to do at all. And yet how did the men look at that? 3/4 of the men said, "That's exactly what we think they're trying to do. That's exactly the reaction that we had. That's exactly the kind of attention that drew." Men had to be able to teach their wives and their daughters what is acceptable. I can remember many times as our children were growing up, and even my wife, the same way, would come and say, I'm not sure about this. And especially with reference to our children, we try to teach our children, the fact that you came to us and asked us about the fact that you're not sure, what should that tell you about that garment? If it's that close, if that's pushing the line, then if you doubt it, then just don't wear it. When in doubt, leave it out. Fathers need to be the final line. I would suggest to you also that wives and daughters need to respect the attitude, the opinion, and the ruling of husbands and fathers. We looked this morning in that study. 3/4 of the women did not intend on that kind of a display. That wasn't what they were going for, but that had no bearing on the fact of men looking at that and believing that that was what they were doing. It may be that as you look in the mirror, I don't see what his problem is. Mothers with daughters, don't undermine the head of the house. Don't undermine and say, well, I don't know what his problem is. Go ahead, put a coat on, cover it up, get out of the house so he can't see, and then you'll be fine. You're undermining what the head of the house is attempting to do and teach modesty. Elders need to instruct the women in a local congregation what is modest and what is not. And if you're a woman in this congregation and the elders have instructed this and have gone to you about that, respect. I don't see what the big deal is. That may very well be the case. And that might very well be a true statement on your account. But if the elders of the congregation see an issue, respect their authority. Wives, daughters, and women may not see the problem. Trust the men that are coming to you. They see the problem. But preachers need to preach on this as well. And they need to be specific. And so we're going to be specific in this one slide. Where do the principles of modesty apply? Everywhere unless you're getting married. Doesn't apply to the wedding dress. Is that right? The principles of modesty apply everywhere except to the bridesmaid dresses. Is that right? Principles of modesty don't apply there. Have you ever thought about the fact that the number of individuals that are going to be coming to your wedding, there are going to be a number of individuals that probably are not going to be children of God, are not going to be Christians. What a great opportunity for us to display modesty. And yet so many times they come, and what do they see? Nothing different than what they would have seen in their own weddings. I want you to consider something else. What about sports uniforms and sporting events? There are a couple of reasons why I'm about ready to just forget taking sports trips. As I mentioned this morning, I drive a bus, and so sometimes I take various sports teams. But I'll tell you what, fortunately this year I didn't have to take any volleyball, any girls volleyball. I don't know how it is up here, or down here, I guess. We're up there. I don't know how it is down here, but I tell you in Missouri, there's not much to the imagination on high school girls' volleyball shorts. They're just glorified underwear tights, if you will. Let's say, well, that's a sporting event. So, okay, so, and what the rest of the sentence is, so modesty doesn't apply. That's what they're trying to say. When did that become the case? Our children ran track. Well, our youngest two did. And you know what some of the track uniforms look like. Almost glorified bathing suits. Our children didn't wear those. And so, yes, they stood out to a degree, but it also opened doors of opportunity. Why don't you wear what everybody else wears? Here's why. It applies to sports. It applies to kind of sporting events. It applies to recreation. swimming and boating. It applies to activities like cheerleading and beauty pageants. Where in our life would we say, now modesty, no, it doesn't apply here. It doesn't apply. Well, everybody's doing it. Well, you know what? If that's the nature of that activity, that immodesty is involved in that and that you can't get away from it, why don't we step back and think if we should even, be involved in that activity? Why does that never cross our minds? Well, that would be horrible if they didn't play a sport. Well, that would be terrible if they didn't get it. Everybody, that's just a high school experience. That's the college experience. How about the godly experience? How about that? Modesty applies, brethren, in all of these places. But too many times what happens is we lay out the principles of modesty, and I mean we and preachers, we lay out the principles of modesty and we don't give the application. That applies here and here and here and here. I know you know Caleb Westbrook. His dad is one of our elders, and he's made the comment several times. And finally, the first time he said that, I thought, well, that's kind of harsh. But now I understand why he said, people are dumb. You have to make it very plain in the matter of application. You can't just lay the principle out there and expect them to take the principle, look at the practice that they're doing, and draw the connection. A lot of times that's not made. And so you've got to say, here's the principle, here are the principles of modesty, and they apply in the sporting events, they apply at your wedding, they apply in all the various areas, they apply in all of these places. But too many times what happens is that preachers do a wonderful job. We were in North Carolina a few years ago, and we had friend of ours out there was preaching, and he gave a lesson on modesty. And I'm like, wow. My ears kind of perked up when he said he's going to talk about modesty. And there's a fantastic lesson on modesty. The principles of modesty, not a lick of application. None. Does modesty apply to dress? Or does modesty in dress apply to men? Why in the world would I ask that question? Well, here's some things that people have said. Well, the New Testament scriptures on dress are only addressed to women, not men. Go to 1 Timothy chapter 2. Who's that addressed to? Women. Go to 1 Peter chapter 3. Who's that addressed to? Women. That's what we're told. Men are warned about lusting. There's your lust issue and modesty. Women aren't. Matthew chapter 5, 27 through 28. Well, let's think about this for a moment. If this is true, then there will be no scriptures regarding a man being naked, because one of the issues of modesty is nakedness. And if man can't be naked, it doesn't apply. There's no such thing as nakedness in reference to the male, then that might be a valid point. So there'll be no scriptures regarding a man ever being naked, and there'll be no scriptures regarding a woman struggling with lust. But you'll look in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 25. The passage tells us that we looked at this morning that when Eve was created, that both, not just Eve, both Adam and Eve were naked and not ashamed. But they'll say, this just has reference to the shame. In other words, there's no shame at this point. They're innocent in regards to sin. That's what that nakedness has reference to, some have said. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7, we see that they knew that they were naked, and so they made loin coverings. And so now this is come back on that. They'll say, well, that just shows their attempt to cover their guilt with clothes. It's just a metaphorical use. Okay. Then we come to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 21. God made garments of skin and clothed them. Well, what about this? Is God covering guilt or God covering bodies? And if God is covering bodies, then we back up and we know what's happening in Genesis 3 and 7, and we know what's happening in Genesis 2 and verse 25, don't we? We're not talking about a metaphorical use of nakedness, that it is representative of shame, of innocence. That's not what's being talked about at all in this text. We're talking about individuals and their clothing or lack thereof and needing to be clothed. And when God stepped into the picture, He clothed them, not clothed their guilt, not covered their guilt. He covered their bodies. And so Seems like it applies to men. Think about the story that's found after the flood in Genesis chapter 9. Noah gets drunk and his sons come and Ham saw the nakedness. Wait a minute, I didn't think that's possible. Well, it is. The nakedness of his father. Shem and Japheth come and they covered the nakedness of their father. And they did it in such a way that they turned their faces away. Why? So that they did not see their father's nakedness. It seems as though the nakedness issue applies to men. Think about it, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 26. No high altars. We looked at that this morning. No high altars. Why? So that your nakedness. Who were the priests? It wasn't women. It was men. So that men's nakedness will not be exposed. That was the consideration. It seems like modesty is an issue even for men. Exodus chapter 28 and verse 42. The priests were to have breeches, if you will, to cover, it says, to cover their bare flesh. It seems as though modesty is a concern for men as well as women. Think about Luke chapter 8 and verse 27, where you have the demon-possessed man. And it is said of this man that he had been without clothing for a long time, just running around in the tombs naked. But the people come out to see Jesus, and they see this man sitting by Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9 and 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, the same exact word is used in reference to women and elders. Proper clothing in reference to women, respectable in reference to elders in chapter 3 and verse 2. And that word is not only the propriety of dress and demeanor, but of his inner life uttering and expressing itself outwardly. The same word that's used to describe a woman's clothing is said of an elder. He needs to be respectable. Respectable even in his dress and demeanor. It applies to him as well. What about Matthew chapter 5, 28 through 30? Is lust only a problem for men? How do you explain the popularity of the Chippendale male dancers? How do you explain the popularity of male strip clubs? How do you explain the popularity of those things? How do you even explain the existence of those things? If lust is only a problem for the men and is no issue for the women, how do you explain the existence of these things? Lust is a problem. Obviously, these men dress or the like thereof to elicit a lustful response. Say, well, okay, that's just an illustration. All right, how about a scriptural illustration? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, in verses 1 through 5, the Apostle Paul addresses the fact that they were withholding sexual relations, husbands and wives, from each other. And Paul says, concerning these things, that's not good for a man not to touch a woman. But because, or it is good for a man not to touch a woman, but because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman to have her own husband. A husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come again together, so that Satan will not tempt who? You, the husband and the wife, because of your lack of self-control. Lust is going to cause a problem wherein there is abstinence in a marital relationship. Does that problem just exist for the man? Both are warned about this. Satan will step in and will tempt both of you. Lust is also a problem for women. The question then is, does modesty and dress apply to men? Well, just from those few passages of Scripture, I think we would have to suggest absolutely. And so finally, the summary of our lesson this day, 3 modesty issues that we see, I think, addressed in Scripture. A nakedness issue, a lust issue, and a heart issue. We've seen who should teach modesty. And I would urge you again, women, when a male influence comes to you and expresses a concern about clothing, please listen. It may not seem like any big deal to you, but do you want to be the one that causes someone to stumble? Matthew 18, remember what the Lord said about those who cause one to stumble. It's better for a millstone to be hung around his neck and to be cast into the depths of the sea. And then we've seen that modesty does apply to men. So does God care how we dress? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, we in our society, we're having an opportunity more and more to open doors of conversation because of the rampant immorality and immodesty in our society. We ought not to view this as some sort of a terrible burden that we must bear, that we can't dress like others. We ought to see it as an incredible opportunity wherein we are absolutely different, and people ask us and we say, let me tell you why I don't dress like everybody else. It's a fantastic opportunity to show the light of the gospel. Take your songbooks out and turn them to the number that's been selected. You've been a very kind audience. I appreciate your attention. There was much to cover both this morning and this evening. I want you to understand that these kind of lessons, they're never easy lessons to deliver. It is the truth, but they're never easy to deliver because challenging people to think about their personal choices and decisions and challenging them to maybe rethink is dangerous. But growth is dangerous. Or growth, I shouldn't say is dangerous. Growth is painful. Growth is something that at times we need to recognize I need to be rebuked. I need to be confronted. Sometimes we're not even aware of what it is that we're doing. We're not even thinking about it until someone says, did you ever think about, I've had those moments. And like, no, I don't know where my head was. I don't know why I didn't think about that. And I've appreciated those who have come and said, and had the courage to come and to say. I want you to understand that if someone comes to you and expresses a concern, I want you to recognize the amount of courage it took them to come to you and tell you, I'm worried. I want you to also think about the amount of love they must have for you, that they would come in an awkward situation about a difficult subject and say, I'm worried about this. How much love they must have for you. What a blessing. You have those kind of people in your life. That's not a curse. That's a blessing. I hope you have that here. If you're here this evening and your life is not what it needs to be, then that's on you. You can look around and you can make excuses as to why it is that you're not doing what you should do, but ultimately it is the fellow in the mirror that's calling the shots. It's the fellow in the mirror that's going to make the decision. Now, you may have obstacles to overcome, you may have difficulties, and you may have more than other individuals, but ultimately you are the one. God has not given you anything that you cannot overcome, and with His help, cannot conquer. If you're here this evening and your life is not right, don't leave here without being in a right relationship with God. Whatever we can do to help, let us know. Come forward, for together we stand and sing.